Okay, this is my story about playing a gig with The Who, the band from England. My generation. Anyway, I was in the Northwest Company. I was the drummer in a West Coast band from Vancouver called the Northwest Company, a 6-member recording group who wrote original songs and performed songs also by other music artists. We were sort of like Paul Revere and the Raiders, who we also played concerts with them. Played 2 or 3 times with Paul Revere and the Raiders. The Who performed in Vancouver sometime around 1968. Daryl Burlingham, who was called Daryl B., was a disc jockey for the radio station CKLG or C-Fun at the time. He got us a spot on the show as an opening act. I'd just returned from living in New Zealand for a year, and the Northwest Company had called me and sent me a letter, actually, and asked me to come back and be their drummer. And they were actually, I'd been in the Questions before I'd went to New Zealand, and the Northwest Company was recording. They'd had records out already, and they were doing TV shows, and I thought, oh boy, this is my chance. So it was my first taste of the big time, and the biggest, most prestigious gig I'd ever played on. The Who were huge at the time with their hit song, My Generation. I remember our band standing around the dressing room with Daryl B. and The Who, the band, the members from The Who, were all drinking Scotch or Canadian rye whiskey, probably whiskey. They loved the Canadian whiskey. It was popular around the world. The Who was dressed up in their outfits they wore back in the 60s. And our bands wore outfits also. We used to wear matching outfits. I can't remember if we did at that show. As the psychedelic age came on, we all dressed differently. Anyway, it was very exciting to be close to the famous band. The 2 people from The Who that really stuck with me was Pete Townsend and Keith Moon. Pete was wearing a frilly shirt like he did in those days, and I was talking to Keith. He was great at joking, and we were all drinking a lot. We talked about music, all kinds of things. Roger Daltrey was also fun, and John Entwistle was a little quieter. My band, the Northwest Company, we went on stage to perform first. Behind the stage, I remember seeing The Who's equipment and seeing how beat up Keith Moon's drums were from beating on them at the shows. He also had a big box of extra cymbals, thinned ones called crash cymbals. He used to hit them so hard they would crack and break. The concert was at the Agrodome in Vancouver, which was the biggest venue at the time for large events. It was designed as a place for a circus and had another building with a tunnel attached for the animals. It was also good for concerts. That's where the place I met the Rolling Stones on the other story. Keith Moon was quite the guy. He was kind of like a wild guy. He was drinking heavier than the other guys too. And he was a crazy guy, but fun. The Agrodome, the biggest drawback about the Agrodome was the sound was horrible. The echo was so bad, the sound get lost in that place. My drums were on a high platform set up behind the rest of the band members. And when we started to play music, the slapback from the drums and the other instruments was so confusing and terrible, I had a super hard time being able to play, let alone I was nervous. And with a hugely important event like that, you'd hit the drum and you'd hear the slapback of that noise coming back a split second later. So you really, really had to concentrate to try to, the amps were all ahead of me, so I couldn't hear worth a darn. Nowadays they wear earphones and everything. So one thing embarrassingly funny happened when we were performing. I dropped or broke a drumstick and it fell to the stage in the front. And Ray O'Toole, our guitar player, picked it up and threw it into the audience as a souvenir. Someone picked it up and threw it back. How embarrassed. They wanted The Who, not us. In those times, I used to wear black leather gloves because we played so loud and so hard. They looked kind of cool. And they didn't mic the drums back then, so I used to get big blisters on my hands because my hands would sweat and I couldn't hang onto the drumsticks because the Northwest Company, we played very loud. I used the back end of my drumsticks in those days to try to keep up to the amps because there was no mics, I also remember how Keith Moon would bounce. He would bounce his drumsticks off the floor tom. He'd throw the drumstick on the floor tom, and it would flip around, go way up high in the air, and he would catch them and keep on playing. And he did some fancy stick twirling, too, which really impressed me. I did stick twirls, too, but this bouncing it off the drum was very good. He didn't catch everyone, though, but it was a good trick I'd never seen before. Roger Daltrey put on quite a show. I can't remember how he was dressed. I know years later he wore a coat with long fringes hanging from the back. It was buckskin. I can't remember if he wore that there. I think he did, but I'm not sure. But he was raising his arms and moving around. He was a really good showman, master showman. He'd pick up the microphone stand and do all kinds of tricks by lifting up above his head, twirling it around. He could also push the top of the stand when it was sitting upright. He'd push it and it would flop over away from him, but just enough so it wouldn't fall right over, and it would tilt back and right back at him, which was a really neat trick. He had the balance part down just so it would go down far enough to come back to him, and that would spring back, And then he would also he'd also mastered another trick he'd mastered with the microphone. He had a really long cord, and he'd twirl this microphone around his head like a lasso thing, and he'd throw it out in the audience above their heads, and it would go flying way out there, and then he'd yank it back and catch it, which was a really great trick. So it was like the lasso would get it momentum. He'd go fly over the audience heads, pull back the cord, and he would catch it every time. It was really impressive. The crowd loved it. At the end of the Who's performance, they all smashed and wrecked their equipment. I remember Pete Townsend smashing his guitar into the amp a bunch of times and hitting it on the stage and smash it into bits. Keith Moon kicked over his drums and banged on him, and he beat the heck out of him and kicked. That's why they were so beat up. And he pushed his drums over off the platform onto the lower stage and trashed them. That's why they were all trashed, those drums. The crowd went wild, and it was a part of their act. I think there was a bit of a riot after, but what fun we had. It was great.